A very warm welcome to the Art Vlog, the channel that explores the art scene in London, the southeast of England, and sometimes beyond. Today I wanted to take you to Entangled Pasts, Art, Colonialism and Change at the Royal Academy. This shows on until the 28th of April and promises to be part of a conversation about art and its role in shaping narratives of empire, enslavement, resistance, abolition and colonialism, and how it may help set a course for the future. This is the Royal Academy's big spring blockbuster, and really excited to take a look inside. The exhibition actually begins in the courtyard with this showstopper of a piece by artist Tavares Storm. He reimagines the Last Supper as by Leonardo da Vinci and fills this sculptural work with 12 prominent black figures who range from Mary Seacole and Shirley Chisholm to Harriet Tubman, Marsha Johnson and Marcus Garvey. Jesus is replaced by Emperor Haile Selassie, and Strawn himself is Judas. This work is a joyous piece, and it sets the tone for an exhibition which gets us to rethink about traditional narratives and where these narratives came from and who produced them. Once inside, we're led upstairs, and the exhibition starts in a darkened rotunda, which is a very powerful way of displaying the works. We're encouraged to remember that the Royal Academy was founded in 1768, at a time when the British Empire was becoming formalised and when slavery had in no way been abolished. I couldn't help but think that the lofty classical ideals of the first members of the Royal Academy, as shown in this bust, clash sharply with the political situation. The exhibition constantly asks us to look again and challenge our own preconceptions. A series of portraits of black subjects are brought together, and they certainly do this. Gainsborough's portrait of Ignacio Sancho, which you can see here, languid and easygoing, shows us a musician, shopkeeper, and man of letters who was the first man of African descent to vote in a British election. Whereas Francis Barber was born into slavery in Jamaica and brought to Britain aged 15, where he became secretary and heir to Georgian great Samuel Johnson. Next to him is a work by John Singleton Copley, who was the only Royal Academician who we know owned slaves, while Scipio Moorhead was an enslaved artist working in Boston in the United States. Sadly, none of his work survived, so it's left to Kerry James Marshall to portray him. Room 2 is totally dominated by Hugh Locke's Armada, a stunning work which hangs and moves like a ghostly remembrance of the past. We spot ships from different periods of history like the Mayflower, the Empire Windrush. We see East India Company ships mixed with fishing boats and cargo vessels. And the detail is such that you're just encouraged to walk round and round it and you're drawn in. And it contrasts really well with the Watsons and the Shark, a work by John Singleton Copley, which was a huge hit at the Royal Academy in 1778 and shows a dramatic rescue. Benjamin West's The Death of General James Wolfe was shown at the Royal Academy Annual Exhibition in 1771, and I was really aware that while viewers back then would have been totally focused on the sacrifice of General Wolfe, today we're drawn to that First Nation figure brooding, squatting on the left, and the story that this painting tells us about the colonial impact on indigenous groups, especially in North America and Australia. Dido Bell, appearing on the left of this work, was the illegitimate daughter of an enslaved woman and a Royal Navy officer. She was brought to London, where she lived in Kenwood House, and we're forced to question what her life would have been like in this alien city. We're also invited to compare the use of portraiture as a way of expressing power by looking at this portrait of Haitian King Henry Christophe and comparing it to Reynolds' portrait of George IV, being served by a black figure whose identity is concealed. And when we see the documentation, we see that Reynolds simply recorded this person as black in his sitter's book, where a name would have usually been. Whereas another modern artist, Wiley, sees his sitter riff on Reynolds by adopting a pose from Reynolds' portrait of Captain Arthur Blake. The room sites of power, tradition, and appropriation asks us to look at the different layers of complexity surrounding colonialism and cultural identity. Thomas Banks, you can see here, was one of the leading neoclassical sculptors of his time. He was a political radical. He was a member of the Society for Constitutional Information, which called for lots of radical reforms for the time, including universal male suffrage, and he compared the conditions of 9/10 of English people to slaves, and yet he accepted commissions from the East India Company, that driving force of British colonialism. Similarly, Edward Penny, the Royal Academy's first professor of painting, was also commissioned by the East India Company, who committed many crimes in India. Both he and Joshua Reynolds admired miniatures by Mughal artists that we see in the exhibition and that you can see here. But artists the Singh trends show similar admiration and influences for these Mughal miniatures, as well as taking on other images like those of British satirists and Persian manuscripts. Shazia Sekunder's work in producing a synthesis of artistic traditions turns the question of cultural appropriation on its head and raises questions about what art is actually authentic. I really enjoyed that. And Robert Hall's Lost Tribes reconfigures a version of Benjamin West's The Death of General Wolfe, and the colonial names of indigenous tribes are laid out in grids in a minimalist, almost conceptual style. The room Beauty and Difference landscape and architecture, first of all, presents us with a series of idealized landscapes of colonial possessions, like this one from what we would call today Varanasi in India. These paintings are clearly for Western eyes. They almost take on a propaganda value of an empire which is both beautiful but also harmonious and a force for good. And then we're asked to contrast this with a modern work by artist Karen McLean called Primitive Matters Huts, which shows a series of seven traditional Caribbean buildings, obviously miniaturized, and contrasts them with the huge houses of the magnificent seven buildings that surround the largest park in Port of Spain in Trinidad. And these buildings were obviously inhabited by merchants and leading religious figures and of great powers of empire. We're then asked to contrast images of idealized colonial families with contemporary artistic responses. This portrait coming up now of the fact of Sir William Young and his family, reminds us that actually Sir William Young was a colonial governor who owned 896 slaves. And we see the contrast in this installation piece, which actually dominates the gallery, woman moving up, which gives a very different voice and a very different perspective. I found this work by Mahina Chandra really powerful. Her family were forced to leave India to go to Fiji as indentured labourers under the British Empire. And her artistic response is to take multiple images of her father from family albums, cut out his silhouette and replace it by a imagined landscape. This work talks about loss and absence. One of the most uncomfortable images in the exhibition is a reproduction of Thomas Stothard's design, Voyage of the Starboard Venus from Angola to the West Indies, which appeared in a book portraying the triangular slave trade as humane. The exhibition then shows images from artists responding to this unsettling image. Cara Walker's design for Fons Americanus will be familiar to many art lovers from the Turbine Hall. And I didn't actually realise the direct reference to Copley's Watson and the Shark. The signature image of the show is this one by Cara Walker, and it kind of appears on all the advertising, this ship being held up by a pair of black hands. Poetry by Phyllis Wheatley, written while enslaved in Boston in 1773. She became the first African American to publish a volume of poetry. Is contrasted with Cara Walker's volume of pop-up silhouettes, which reminded me of her screen-based works that I saw in the Black Fantastic. The next room is dominated by Isaac Julian's epic Lessons of the Hour. an impassioned portrait of Frederick Douglass. It's really worth sitting to watch this piece, which has been shown relatively recently in London. I didn't realise that that Douglas had travelled around the UK between 1845 and 1847 with a anti-slavery message, um, encouraging British people to get behind the abolition of slavery in his native United States. This room traces the involvement of lives of people of colour who've been involved in the Royal Academy in many guises. We learned that William Morrison Brown was a Jamaican who was invited into the school in the 1830s, and that Fanny Eaton was a much sought after model during the 1850s. The exhibition admits that many subject matter which involve people of colour was chosen as a kind of route into the exotic or the different or the otherworldly in some way. The Babylonian marriage market was a huge hit at the 1875 exhibition. This provocative portrayal of women meant it caused mass controversy. But the Pipes of Freedom, a painting celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation in the States, was rejected by the Royal Academy, and I was left wondering why. This work by Keith Piper was very powerful, and it kind of satirized the so-called scientific racial theories of the 19th and 20th centuries. Whiteness refers to both cotton and to race in this room. If you look carefully at the ironing board in this work, you'll see a depiction of a British slave ship with the bodies tightly packed in, and behind is a cotton sheet embroidered with the letters KKK. Barty Palmer's work refers back to Khadi, the Gandhi-inspired cotton that he encouraged Indians to produce as a route to self-sustainability and independence. This picture reminds us that those people who've had power in the Royal Academy in deciding what's on show have predominantly been white and male. And there's a wonderful contrast with Lay Back, Keep Quiet and Think of What Made Britain So Great by Sonia Boyce, in reminding us that ultimately the empire and the notions of racial superiority that came with it have been essential for creating so much of Britain's wealth and prosperity, and still does. This is a long, sometimes knotty exhibition, but in terms of pure art, Crossing the Waters, the Aquatic Sublime, brings you some of the strongest works. After Alanatsoy's work you see here, the theme is broadly about the ocean, water, the Middle Passage, travel. Two wonderful Turners, where he's pushing towards semi-abstraction, can be found together on one wall, where we also get to see, in my opinion, one of Frank Bowling's masterpieces, The Middle Passage, a beautiful, troubling, haunting work. In its own little studio piece is a really interesting film called Vertigo Sea, which combines different images, as you can see here, from different sources. It's long, but it's worth sitting through and enjoying. And Ellen Gallagher's work looks at this imaginary underwater realm at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, inhabited by the pregnant African women who were thrown overboard from slave ships during the Middle Passage. It's a really sort of chilling, interesting work. And Naming the Money, which was shown at the Lubaina Himid retrospective at Tate Modern, is one of my favourites. A multimedia work. It gives a voice to the voiceless enslaved peoples, and the audio is absolutely key for this. It's a really powerful work. Overall, I'm really pleased the Royal Academy has decided to interrogate its own relationship with colonialism and slavery, and in doing so, asks us to interrogate all British institutions' relationships with colonialism and slavery, and how they and we as a country have benefited from these repugnant institutions and still continue to benefit today. the narrative of this show and the investigation and history requires some bad art to be shown, as well as some fantastic explosive art. And it's really interesting that, with the exception of the Turners and some of the portraits in the first room, the highlights are absolutely from contemporary masters like Frank Bowling and Sonia Boyce. And this is a real celebration of our contemporary art by artists of colour, and I really enjoyed that. Um, Overall, I give this show a 7 out of 10, because I thought that while some of the theming in attempting to tell the narrative worked really well, I thought some of the rooms were centered around themes which were loose, and I thought the exhibition could have been a bit tighter in this sense. I thought the £22 is reasonable value, but it is a knotty analytical show, so you have to be prepared to give yourself the time to really get the most out of it and have a look at the documents and the supporting artifacts as well. The show's on until the 28th of April, and as I say, I'm really glad the Royal Academy's put this on. For me, it's an important show in the Royal Academy's long history. Some of the contemporary artists in this show also featured in a wonderful exhibition called In the Black Fantastic at the Hayward Gallery. Do check out my review of that. The link is above.